V Rising, the newest vampire action-adventure base-building crafting game released by Dunley Studios after 2 years of early access development. Well, now it's finally out, and I've had my eye on this one for a while. The developers were kind enough to provide me with a review copy of the game, so in this video we're going to review it in its 1.0 state, and take a look at all of the gameplay and its systems as I work my way up the vampiric food chain, in an attempt to defeat Dracula himself. Before we get going, I wanted to let you guys know that I've created a Patreon page, so if you'd like to support my content, please check the link in the description.
The rulers of the night have returned. The vampires are rising.
V Rising is both a PvP and PvE game, so the type of server that you play on will affect your gameplay drastically. You can choose to play on a private or official server with PvP turned on or off. You've also got the option of choosing difficulty modes. You've got normal and brutal, and for my sanity I choose normal mode. The world of V Rising is broken up into 4 acts, with each act presenting its own locales, enemies and progression systems, and each act concludes with a tussle with a specific boss that we'll need to take on to progress. And so, I create my very own vampire and our journey begins.
I am alive.
We awaken in a graveyard just south of the Firstborn woods, the first region of the game, and right off the bat we're given our very first quest to craft our first set of armor. There's a number of ways you'll be progressing through the game, whether that be through completing quests designed to teach you the basic mechanics of the game, or through the act of murdering various bosses, which allow you to unlock and craft more and more advanced items and buildings. To craft bone guard armor, we'll need to collect bones dropped by skeletons, and here we get our first taste of combat. V Rising has a robust combat system that will increase in complexity as we rise the ranks, but for now we're taught the basics. Attacking with your currently equipped weapon can be performed using the right mouse button, which will cause your character to perform a basic 3-strike combo, and thankfully we can hold the button down, so no carpal tunnel for me. At the start of the game we have access to some very basic spells in the form of a defensive block and a ranged blood fireball. Nice. When fully kitted out, you'll have access to a primary attack, a dodge on cooldown, 2 basic spells that can be swapped and changed depending on your preferred build, an ultimate ability, and later 2 weapon skills which will change depending on the weapon type you have equipped. We'll look at all of this in more depth as we go, but for now I smack a few skeletons and use their bones to craft our very first set of armor. Equipment can be broken down into a few categories, and throughout your travels you'll be able to equip 4 pieces of armor, a ring or a necklace, melee and ranged weapons, a cape, and a helmet which provides cosmetic bonuses. Easy peasy. After donning our first set of bone guard armor, we're tasked with setting up our first base, and to do this we'll need to collect a supply of wood and stone, which can be gathered up from the nearby surroundings. Just whack things a few times with your sword and a few chunks of wood and stone will pop out. Nice. Crafting, building and resource collection are all deeply embedded into the core gameplay systems, and these ideas are executed really well. Resource gathering is seamlessly integrated into combat, which ensures that you'll never be inconvenienced by having to carry around specific gathering tools like pickaxes or hatchets, which makes the process of gathering base building materials fluid and intuitive. While you do have access to specialized gathering tools if you want to min-max, I found that the brute force method worked just as well. After a few minutes of gathering, I set to work on my very first base, and the first thing you'll need to do is find a suitable place to plop down your castle heart. This heart can be placed in specific plateaus scattered across the map, and it's up to you where you want to move in. To make an area suitable for base building, you'll need to clear it of rocks, rubbles and trees. So after a bit of cleaning up, I put down the heart, a few walls, floors and doors to keep the ghosts and ghoulies out, and we're all set. I can imagine that playing on a PvP server might make base finding slightly difficult if all the good spots are taken, and I remember this being a hot topic back when the game was released in early access, especially among players complaining that their favourite spots were taken or griefers blocking people in. But playing on a private solo server, I didn't encounter any of this. Building works on a grid system similar to other games like Valheim or Enshrouded, and bits of your base can be snapped, rotated or changed without much trouble. After a few moments of building, our base is erected. Oh, grow up. Next I set to work filling it with stuff, and so I build some chests for basic storage, crafting benches for, well, crafting, a coffin to mark our respawn point, and some mist braziers which block out the sun, and I'll talk about why this is important later on. The building mechanics of V Rising are another really well implemented set of systems, and I had no trouble with them throughout my playthrough. So far, I'm really impressed with the level of seamless integration of mechanics and how fluid the gameplay feels from combat to base building. It all works really well. I do have some complaints about the overall building and crafting systems, and if you've been keeping an eye on the game you'll probably already know what I'm talking about, but I'll touch on that in more detail later on. When enemies are close to death, you can press the F button on them to consume their blood, refilling your blood meter displayed in the ARPG style vial at the bottom of the screen. Every enemy is categorized by a specific type of blood, ranging from creature, rogue, scholar, or even more unique ones like Draculan or mutant bloods, which are found in the higher level areas, and each of these blood types grant unique bonuses specific to that type of blood. For example, the worker blood type increases resource gathering rates, while the rogue type boasts movement speed. Every enemy also has a varying level of blood quality, ranging from 0 to 100%, which affects the potency of bonuses bonuses you receive for stealing their precious fluids. Your blood levels deplete over time, and if your reserves hit 0, you'll gradually lose health, requiring you to regularly drink the blood of your enemies to stay alive. This system adds another small layer of depth to character progression for players to consider, and in the early game these systems are very straightforward. Simply drink the blood of the people you kill to prevent yourself from dying, but in the late game you'll unlock ways to drink blood more easily, and you'll be able to tailor your blood type to your specific build for even more ways to customize. Personally, I didn't really engage with this system much outside of keeping myself alive and finding the strongest enemy nearby when I needed to feed, but it never really felt like a nuisance either. It serves as a good extra reward for those who want to invest time into it. After a little more exploration, it's time for us to begin our climb up the ladder and take on our very first boss. Bosses come in various shapes and sizes, and you'll find a lot of them hanging out inside the various nooks and crannies of the world. At the time of writing this review, there's over 50 bosses, each with their own unique mechanics, animations, and dialogue, and I found the majority of them to be distinct and enjoyable. Early game bosses are pretty straightforward, but as you progress, they'll become increasingly more difficult and complex, and eventually you'll start to encounter multi-phase fights that almost feel like raid encounters from an MMO, which is really cool. The blood hunt mechanic lets you track bosses within the world, and this really awesome boss guide acts as our progression counter. Simply select the boss you want to track and the game will point you in its general direction with this blood trail graphic. V-Rising for me was a game more about the journey than the final destination, and having a progression goal to guide you through the game was really useful, like those Minecraft mod packs. Quests are better than kitchen sinks. There, I said it, come at me. While the hunting system worked fine overall, it would have been more helpful to be given the location of each boss as well, or at least a general area where you might fight them. Sometimes only knowing the direction wasn't really enough to determine if the boss was across the other end of the continent or just around the corner, which made it hard to decide whether or not to teleport with a waystone. I often found myself consulting the wiki just to get an idea of a boss's general location, before using the blood trail to pinpoint them, but this got a bit annoying after doing it 50 times. Using the blood hunt system, I tracked the alpha wolf through the forest and stumble upon a small party of rangers already locked into a battle to the death. This is something you'll see quite often across the world, and every enemy has its own hidden agenda or faction, so you'll often find them fighting each other or engaging in their own activities. This is really cool, and it adds a nice sense of dynamic life and feeling to the world, and it makes you feel like a cog in a much larger machine rather than the all-encompassing player character, which is always a great feeling. Being able to gang up on the poor wolf also makes this fight much easier, and also aligns to that feeling of being a vampire, preying on the weak from the shadows, which is awesome. Overall, not a difficult fight, but a good introduction to the hunting mechanics and a taste of boss combat. Oh, and when a boss dies, they'll usually explode in a Michael Bay fashion, taking out trees and rocks around them, which is undeniably cool, and it gives you some free resources.
New knowledge acquired.
When a boss dies, you'll get the option to extract their V-blood, which unlocks rewards tied to that specific character, and these rewards can range from new crafting recipes, items, or even new abilities like the wolf shapeshift form. Vampire powers are unlocked by defeating specific bosses, and most of these grant you the ability to shapeshift into various forms, with a few exceptions. Defeating the alpha wolf grants us the ability to turn into a wolf, and we can do this at any time. Simply open the vampire powers radial menu and select the wolf form. As a wolf, we can jump short distances, and our movement speed is slightly increased, making it a really handy way to move faster across the world. And come on, who doesn't want to be a vampire wolf? I do have a few issues with this system that annoyed me by the end of the game, such as the fact that getting hit will cancel your wolf form, but I'll whine about that a bit later on. Over the course of our playthrough, we'll unlock even more powers, like being able to transform into a bear, a frog, a spider, or even the ability to do some mind control later as well. While messing around in my base, it's become apparent that a strange bone-corpse amalgamation thing has decided to live outside, and this guy is ridiculously strong. So, after a few deaths, I leave it alone. Finally, after being allowed to leave my own base, I set my sights on two more blood carriers, Keely and Rufus. The map is divided into several regions, spread across farmlands, swamps, forests, mountains, each with its own distinct look, feel, and mechanics to keep the game engaging. Inside each region, you'll find mini-locations that thematically tie into the region itself. For example, in the Firstborn woods you'll find bandit and trapper camps, while in the Dunley farmlands you'll encounter small villages or civilian populations. Each location offers specific resources for crafting, unique enemies to fight and bosses to hunt, and each of these can be viewed on the map, which makes targeted farming of enemies and resources really easy to do, which becomes really important later when the grinding starts. Keely is located in a bandit camp nearby, just a short walk away from our base, and upon arrival I find the location heavily guarded by bandits. Keely fires triple shot arrows which are easily dodged if you're paying attention, and she also shoots arrows into the air, creating an AoE effect on the floor that you'll need to avoid. And this is where I noticed a bit of an unusual issue with the audio.
Freeze!
Is it just me, or was that voice acting unusually loud? This is a problem I encountered quite regularly, and I don't know if I just need to invest in a new pair of speakers, but a lot of the audio seems balanced in a really weird way, making enemy voice lines and combat effects much louder than everything else. This also affected the music as well, which was a shame, because V Rising has an undoubtedly good soundtrack, but I never really got to hear much of it because it's always so quiet compared to everything else.
Miscalculated.
Once Keely succumbs to our general vampire-ness, we get to unlock our first spell. The spellbook system, which was updated in the 1.0 release, allows us to pick spells of our choosing from 6 distinct schools of magic, from blood, chaos, frost, illusion, unholy, and finally storm magic. And each of these schools offer a set of 11 different choices that you can swap and change, depending on your chosen build and playstyle. Most bosses, when defeated, grant a spell point from one of 3 tiers, allowing you to unlock more and more spells as you progress. This system is implemented really well, and each unlock often ties thematically into the boss that you've just fought. For example, defeating Keely the Frost Archer grants us a point into, you guessed it, frost magic, and these little thematic touches really enhance the gameplay experience. Later we'll find that these thematic tie-ins extend to other unlocks as well, and you'll be fighting wizards in forbidden towers to unlock research, or fighting engineers with jetpacks to unlock advanced crafting stations. The second target on our hit list is Rufus the Foreman, and this guy can be found on the eastern side of the forest in a small logging camp. On the way I encounter a guarded caravan travelling the roads, and this is a mini encounter that you'll find while moving around the map every now and again. These well protected wagons can be broken into for valuable rewards, but since they're so heavily guarded, a tough fight ensues, and eventually after murdering everyone we get to break into the caravan, and now we get to loot the lucrative chest inside. This is a wonderful example of how V Rising really lends itself to that vampire-esque feeling, by allowing you to stalk the woods, looking for targets and striking when the moment is right, pillaging and murdering everything in your way. You really start to feel like a vampiric menace raining death and destruction on the land, and this is something we'll look at in more detail in Act 2.
No, this cannot be the end.
We find Rufus, and this time I wait until the sun sets before making my move. Eventually the cover of darkness arrives and we strike, and you'll notice that this guy is using a crossbow. Wouldn't it be cool if this fight unlocked crossbows? Well, it does, and this is awesome. Weapons in V Rising come in various types, including swords, bows, maces, axes, whips, pistols, and every single weapon operates slightly differently, allowing for a variation in mechanic and combat style. Aside from the obvious distinction between ranged and melee weapons, each weapon type grants the player with 2 unique abilities. For example, short swords allow you to do a blade storm style spin attack and a short 3-strike teleport, while axes allow you to launch a small spinning disc, which hits really hard and is surprisingly good at chopping down plants. Crossbows allow you to fire arrows into the air which land in a circular pattern, and you'll also have the ability to fire an interrupting shot which splits into 2 after hitting an enemy. Combining these weapons with either ranged or melee attacks, spells from 5 different schools, ultimate abilities, specific vampire powers, blood type and quality, you have a lot of choices when it comes to build variety and combat. As a vampiric creature of the night, our character has to stay hidden in the shadows during the day to avoid being horribly burned by sunlight. During the night we can freely move around unhindered. V Rising offers an exceptionally well-crafted day and night system, and probably one of the best implementations that I've ever seen in a video game. During the daytime, the sun moves dynamically across the sky, which causes shadows and dark spots to shift along with it, and this dynamic lighting system causes you to have to think about time of day, as well as just a simple choice of is it daytime, yes or no. This mechanic is really engaging, requiring the player to stay frosty during the day by constantly having to seek out shadows to stay alive, and after you get comfortable with this, you'll start weaving it around everywhere, including during travel and combat sequences. It enhances the overall immersive experience by making the world feel alive and realistic. Just be careful about going AFK because you'll probably die every single time. Mechanically speaking, this day and night system worked flawlessly without any glitches or bugs, and in the early game it adds a nice sense of vampire fantasy by making you heed caution, sticking to the shadows and skulking around before awakening stronger and more confident at night, which is really cool. The problem I encountered with this system became apparent when the game progressed, and I noticed these systems becoming more and more intrusive going into the mid and late game, but I'll talk about those as we get there. As we defeat more bosses, we gain the ability to craft research benches, and research is a system that I both love and hate, and this is where the main grind of V Rising comes into play. There's 3 tiers of research benches that you'll unlock, and in the early game we get access to the basic research desk. This system is implemented really well, but it did become quite grindy when trying to unlock something specific. Most containers and defeated enemies have a chance to drop recipes which allow you to unlock specific items, but you'll also be collecting currency items like paper and later scrolls and schematics, which can be consumed in bulk to unlock a new random recipe. This system is implemented really well, but it did become quite grindy when trying to unlock something specific. I found that this system did indeed provide some well-needed longevity to the game and gave me something to continue grinding for, but on the other hand, there were times when I found it difficult to progress due to lacking a specific research item, or being unlucky when it came to random recipes. Sometimes unlocking a new plant pot is not as useful as being able to craft that new iron sword. The higher tiers of research also require more and more research items to use as well. The basic research desk requires 50 paper to unlock a new recipe, but with tier 2 you'll need 75 scrolls and 100 schematics for tier 3. So you can see how this might become time consuming very quickly. It's like playing barrows in old school RuneScape. Getting one item is easy, but trying to unlock a whole set of armor is a lot more luck based and time consuming. Since V-Rising revolves primarily around a gear-based progression system, your gear score becomes one of the most crucial attributes, which you'll need to increase as you ascend the ranks. Gear score also directly influences how much damage you'll deal to bosses, and facing enemies with a higher level than your gear score means dealing less damage to them compared to if you were using better gear. I think the actual value is something like 4% less damage per level, so gear score is almost like a prerequisite for challenging the higher level bosses. Personally, I don't really mind this system because I am a fan of progression-based games, and grindy games are like my own personal crack. But I can see why this might not be for everyone, especially if you're someone who wants to confront Dracula at level 1 for example. Your gear score would prevent you from doing this. I mean, I say that, I'm 99% sure that someone has already done a level 1 Dracula kill, because the internet is a crazy place. To finish up Act 1 we need to defeat Quincy the Bandit King, and to even stand a chance against this boss we're going to need to upgrade our gear, so I begin the grind, killing bosses, crafting base components and unlocking research recipes. One of the biggest issues I have with V-Rising in its current state is the storage and crafting systems. Crafting as a mechanic is implemented really well, and you can see that a serious amount of time and effort has been placed into making sure that the crafting systems are robust, making them easy to use and complex enough to entice players to continue playing. But there aren't really any automated storage options available, and every time you want to craft a specific item you'll need to find that item manually and have it in your inventory, and this got very annoying very quickly. In the early game you'll have access to basic chests, which store any and all types of items, so item management became a problem quite quickly, and I found myself spending more time tidying my storage than I did actually play in the game. In the later sections of the game this did become less of an issue, due to having the ability to craft storage for specific types of items, which is really handy. I found myself in a routine, every time I came back to base, opening and automatically dumping all items into each chest one by one, and this was an okay solution, but I still would have liked to have been able to dump all of my items automatically, without having to open every single container manually. I won't pretend to understand the intricacies of developing a AAA survival crafting game, so I'm assuming that there's a specific reason as to why this hasn't been looked at yet. Considering the wealth of the quality of life upgrades that have been applied to the game in its early access state, I really hope that this is something the developers are considering, because from reading the various forums, it seems that I'm not the only one having this issue. Honestly, in my opinion, this probably not so simple behind the scenes change would improve the game by a huge margin. Just give me a button to automatically store items from my inventory, and allow me to craft directly from my storage. Oh, and item placeholders. Give me those as well. To get inside the town where Quincy lives, we need to kill another boss to unlock bear form, which allows us to break down tough gates. So first I murder Kodia the ferocious bear, and now we can shapeshift into a huge hulking beast. Not so ferocious now, are you? Quincy the Bandit King is by far the most difficult boss we've encountered, and he'll likely be a major hurdle for new players. A lot of bosses in V-Rising are designed to exist between major gear score brackets, meaning that while it's possible to sometimes outgear your opponents, it's never usually possible to gear up enough to trivialize a fight, unless you're a filthy hacker of course. The Bandit King has a few clearly telegraphed attacks, including the ability to summon guards which need to be killed as soon as possible, and he can also do a charge attack and some frontal abilities, which need to be avoided. Quincy also has a barrier which acts very similar to the barrier spells accessible by players, and this is really cool. When an enemy or a player activates a barrier, they'll be protected from damage until the effect ends. But if you or an enemy attack this barrier, it'll proc an ability which differs depending on the school of magic used. For example, Quincy uses a barrier to prevent frontal attacks, but when struck, it'll cause the attacker to suffer fire damage over time. There's other barrier spells as well, including Ward of the Damned, which causes skeletons to spawn when the barrier is struck, or the Frost Barrier, which inflicts a chill effect. This is a great risk-reward system, which has been very obviously developed for PvP combat, but it also lends itself really well to all aspects of PvE as well, because a lot of the abilities that you'll see being used by bosses are abilities that the player can gain access to sooner or later, and bosses suffer the same consequences as players, so you won't see situations like in MMOs for example, where a boss might be immune to crowd controls or slows, because that's boring. The combat system is very fair from both perspectives, and I really like this.
A rousing battle! Show me what you got!
with the proper bounce.
Act 2 takes us into the Dunley farmlands, just a short stroll away from the Farbane woods, and here I decide to try out the new base relocation system. To relocate your base, you'll need to construct the relocation heart, which can be plopped down like any other building. This allows us to reclaim all of our items from our old base, transferring them to the new one, and this is an excellent approach and greatly cuts down on the tedium of having to dismantle your old base. You'll still need to clear space and place every item manually though, so I ended up changing the layout of my base every single time I relocated. It would have been nice to be able to move a one-to-one replica of the old base, but now I'm being picky. After relocating our base, I construct a new forge room to complement it, which enables us to smelt and craft iron ore for upgraded weapons and armor. Within our base, we'll be able to construct rooms tailored to specific functions, and by using specific flooring inside these rooms, we can gain bonuses to crafting speed and efficiency. As the game advances, particularly in the later acts, you'll be required to manage different refinement and crafting processes, so it's worth considering the design of your base early on. To craft iron, we're going to need to mine iron, and for that we need to visit the Haunted Mine, conveniently located next to our base. The Dunley farmlands are the main area for Act 2, and this is where the difficulty begins to increase rapidly in terms of crafting and farming requirements, but also straight mechanical difficulty. The farmlands themselves consist of farms and a number of civilian-themed settlements like towns or pastures, and for me, Act 2 was my favourite part of the game, because the overall vampire theme felt really relevant here. I really felt like I was able to rampage around towns, ransacking livestock and being a general undead nuisance. As you cause death and destruction, the innocent villagers will scream and run for their lives, and it almost feels like you're playing GTA Vampire Edition. You'll even be rewarded for breaking into villagers' houses and looting items straight off their shelves, so don't blame me for my psychopathic tendencies. I also began to notice a change in the enemy variety and difficulty as well, and you'll start to encounter packs of enemies with different styles of combat mixed in. So you'll encounter situations where it might be best to kill the rangers before killing the melee enemies, because these stupid fire crossbowmen made me want to snap my keyboard in half. The Haunted Mine contains well-needed iron, but it's also home to two more bosses, Meredith and Krieg. Of the two, Krieg is by far the more difficult boss, especially fresh out of Act 1. If you're lucky, you might encounter a situation where these bosses go head-to-head, fighting each other instead of you. And this is another great example of how V-Rising uses its dynamic world to really inject life and immersion into the game. Just being able to walk around and see various creatures and humans interacting with each other is really great. Krieg the Undead General is a bastard, and I'm not ashamed to admit that he decimated me more than once, to the point where I died trying to get my dropped items back. Seriously, give me a break. So far, I'm really enjoying myself. V-Rising is one of those games where you can either go balls to the walls, full-on sweatfest boss rushes, or you can sit back on a nice rainy day, explore the forest and craft some upgrades, which is really cool. To continue our progression, we're going to need to unlock some more crafting workstations, and to do that, we're going to need to kill Beatrice the Tailor, and she roams around inside Dawnbreak Village. This tiny force of nature is Beatrice, and when provoked, she runs away screaming, aggroing every enemy nearby. On the higher difficulty levels, she adopts new tactics and becomes capable of attacking the player directly, but even on normal mode, she poses a significant challenge to the unprepared. This is a particularly interesting fight, because it shows that the developers have really considered how to make every boss feel unique and interesting, by using the environment and the surroundings to create a challenging battle, which is great to see. There's also these bell-ringing villagers who attract additional enemies if you're not quick enough to catch them, and things can get out of hand pretty quickly.
Please, be merciful.
With Beatrice bested, we can now craft cotton into armor, and what better way to collect cotton than to steal it from the poor villagers? I told you earlier, axes are really good for farming. V-Rising is a game split between two trains of thought. On the one hand, you're striving to unlock bigger and better equipment by conquering increasingly challenging bosses, while on the other hand, you'll be spending a lot of time crafting, building, farming, gathering, grinding, and both of these playstyles really complement each other really well. I found that it's always a struggle to do something for the very first time, such as spinning your very first yarn of cotton or taking on a specific enemy. But once you've accomplished something once, it often becomes easier the next time you do it, through increased power levels, efficient crafting, and so on. And this is a theme we'll be seeing more and more of as we progress the game. An example of this can be seen through blood essence recipes. Initially, crafting Greater Blood Essence will require Unsullied Hearts, which can be collected as a rare drop from difficult enemies and bosses. But then in Act 2, you'll gain access to a new Greater Blood Essence recipe, which makes the whole process faster, cheaper, and easier. And this is really good design. Of course, the older, easier grinds end up getting replaced by newer and more complex ones, but this design keeps you moving forward and makes you feel like you're making progress. Speaking of progress, this is where I hit my next roadblock: research. Because the majority of recipes come from random drops, if you want to methodically craft each and every upgrade, you're going to need to do a lot of farming, and I was honestly surprised by how much grinding is required. Again, for me personally, this isn't a bad thing, because I'm one of those weirdos that likes Black Desert and Minecraft mod packs, but it might not be everyone's cup of tea. You're not obligated to unlock every single new recipe, but if you don't, you'll find yourself with a pick a mix of armor sets just to make ends meet. In the later game, this became even more apparent, and I began to stick with just weapons that I already had to avoid having to farm out 2 or even 3 recipes to upgrade equipment. So there were times when I felt like I wasn't able to swap weapons to try out a new combat style, but after all, grinding is built into this game, so I won't go on about that too much. To ease the burdens of the research systems, you have the option to buy items and recipes from traders, which is pretty cool. In Act 1, you'll use copper to do this, but in Act 2 onwards, these currency items are made of silver. And of course, being a vampire, we're allergic to silver, so holding onto a large amount of these silver items will cause you to take damage over time in the form of silver sickness. Man, I wish I had silver sickness in real life. You know what I mean, I want lots of money. Never mind. I never really engaged with these systems very much, and I often found myself actively ignoring silver in the world, because I didn't want to have to bank these items back at home. You can buy or craft silver resistance potions, but again, not really my cup of tea. I felt like I was being actively discouraged from collecting rewards. To trade with the villagers of Act 2, you'll need to unlock the human form, and you can do this by killing Bane the Shadowblade, who roams the roads randomly. Once you've unlocked human form, you can transform into a slow-moving, tiny, weak human, which is pretty cool, and by doing this, we can now trade with the humans. Just make sure to do this at night, because it's almost impossible to move quickly enough to avoid sunlight during the daytime. After killing some more bosses, I begin to unlock more and more gear recipes to squeeze out a few more gear levels, and most sets of armor in V Rising have a slightly upgraded version with various set bonuses to complement different styles of gameplay. For example, the Hollowfang armor has the same gear score as the Dark Magnus set, which is crafted using the Hollowfang armor pieces, so it's more of a horizontal progression. If you're willing to put the time in to grind the recipes, it's possible to tailor your build in very specific ways, increasing spell damage for example, or adding health leech to attacks. Like I said, I ended up combining different armor pieces just to meet the gear score demands, but I can imagine on brutal difficulty you'll need to spend several hours farming and crafting full sets of armor. Another issue I had with the crafting system was the lack of in-game information in certain areas. After unlocking a recipe for a shiny new necklace at the research desk, I was never told how to craft it, and the recipe itself doesn't give us any information. In the late game, crafting requires the involvement of a number of different machines, from refining resources with looms and tanneries, to crafting items using tailoring or artisan workbenches, and these recipes only appear within these workbenches once they've been unlocked. And as a result, I often found myself using the wiki to figure out which crafting bench I needed to make the item that I'd just researched. And this issue could have easily been addressed by adding the required building for crafting in the recipe tooltip. With our new weapons and armor, it's time for us to finish Act 2. And to do that, we need to defeat Octavian the militia captain. Octavian hangs out inside the bastion of Dunley, a well-defended keep, and even getting to this boss presents a challenge. Oftentimes you'll find the boss at the back of the location, meaning that each area almost feels like a mini open-world dungeon. Octavian is not a joke, and he has a few mechanics to keep you on your toes during the fight, including a few ranged attacks and dashes which you'll need to time right to dodge. As the fight progresses, Octavian will call guards to his side, and these adds need to be killed as soon as possible, because they'll fire flaming arrows from the sidelines which can fill up the arena if left unchecked. He also has a signature ability in which he'll do a Bladestorm type attack which causes a number of circular swords to fire off around him, and if you mistime your dodge, you'll get stuck inside the Bladestorm of Death without an escape route, and you're gonna die pretty quickly. Boss fights in V Rising was something I always enjoyed, and the especially difficult fights were always rewarding, aside from dying over and over again. But one of the main issues I encountered with bosses like Octavian was due to the sun mechanics. In the early game, the sun makes a lot of sense because you're a weak vampire, building strength, struggling to survive. But then in the mid to end game for me, the sun became more of a frustration and less of a positive gameplay addition. When you've got a particularly long boss fight and you're shite at the game like me, you'll die a lot. And doing corpse runs back to the boss takes a minute or two, and by the time you get back, it's likely going to be nearing dawn, meaning that you'll either need to fight the boss in the sun, which is usually impossible, or you'll be forced to wait until the sun goes back down again. And sometimes, for me, this meant going inside a tent and getting some XP in. This became especially annoying in the later game areas, and I'll talk about that when we get there. After around 10 deaths, corpse runs, AFKing, and furiously ranting to myself about sunlight, I eventually defeat Octavian, and in a nice touch, he'll grant you a tier 3 spell unlock for the Storm School of Magic. This allows you to unlock a very similar Bladestorm attack which fires out small electric beams, similar to the signature attack used by the boss. which is really cool. As you progress into Act 3, you'll notice that the game starts to open up a bit, and we get to explore some new locations, including the southern side of Gloomrot, the murky toxic swamp, and the cursed forest, which has its own set of unique and interesting mechanics. Gloomrot is a biome described by the developers as science gone mad, and I think they captured this really well. The biome is split up into the northern, more difficult section, and the southern section which resembles a swamp or a forest warped by plague infestations, causing the flora and fauna to mutate into twisted creatures and monsters. Compared to the very normal looking villages and farmlands of Act 1 and 2, this is a distinct and interesting change. Gloomrot is a good place to build our next base as it's pretty close to the action, so I go through the process of moving my base for a second time. And again, this whole process works really well, and I'm glad that this is a thing, but now I have to deal with all of this. In Act 3, we'll be required to engage with increasingly complex crafting chains, requiring materials like radium alloys and primal blood essence, each of which require its own set of more advanced resources, so be prepared to farm for a lot of tech scraps and mutant grease. To access most of these recipes, we need to confront our first Act 3 boss, and this is the point in the game where I notice a significant increase in difficulty, due to the fact that bosses now have more intricate designs. While in the early game, bosses resembled beefed up normal enemies with basic mechanics. The mid to late game starts to challenge players with increasingly complex mechanics, multi-phase fights, and occasionally entire arenas that change how the boss fight plays out. Take Civer the Engineer. He grants us access to an array of crafting recipes centered around machinery and technology, and you'll find him floating ominously in his arena in a nearby factory. When this boss is engaged, he'll cycle through various weaponry, from Gatling guns to flamethrowers, so there's a bit of complexity to get to grips with. I particularly love this guy's voice lines, because he sounds exactly like you'd imagine a plague-ridden, flamethrowing maniac with a jetpack to sound.
Test results inconclusive.
Back at home, I take the time to upgrade our infrastructure, and to do this we need to craft some more advanced machinery such as fabricators, artisan workbenches, advanced furnaces, and some other things. And one small quality of life feature that I really love, you can attempt to place down a building without having the required materials to build it, meaning that you can plan ahead to see how big something might be, and this allows us to plan our base out over time. A small but significant quality of life time saver. Nice. Around level 60, I started to notice more pronounced gear bottlenecks, and mechanical skills started to become more relevant. In the early game, the main bottlenecks will be Quincy and Octavian, and these guys will often straight up prevent progression until they're defeated, but you'll always be at a comparable gear score. Now I'm starting to notice that the level 60 bosses require you to straight up get good. You won't be able to overpower the bosses by simply outgearing them. I imagine it's probably possible to gain a significant advantage by sitting down and grinding out every recipe, but the emphasis on mechanical skill and mastery of the game becomes significantly more apparent in the later stages, and I can imagine that on brutal mode this is even more pronounced. Our next main upgrade path requires us to unlock and craft Dawnthorn armor, for which we'll need to venture into a completely new region, the Cursed Forest. The Cursed Forest is a distinct location with its own set of mechanics, and it just happens that a lot of our impending progress is tied to bosses and resources in this area. The eerie woodland exudes a spectral, undead ambience and kind of reminds me of something out of Albion Online. The enemies in this area also share the same aesthetic, and you'll find bears, wolves and other creatures, but this time they'll be undead, ghostly versions of these creatures, which is pretty cool. While inside the forest, you'll be accosted by an incremental debuff, stacking slowly from 1 to 100, and when this hits full charge, you'll be enveloped by a thick mist that will obscure both your in-game vision and your map, preventing you from being able to see where you are. When I first noticed this mechanic, it caught me off guard, and I was left wandering the woods until I eventually found an exit. Overall, the implementation of the mist mechanics works really well, and I can imagine that it would work even better in a PvP scenario, adding a nice risk-reward system which isn't present in the other regions, akin to games like the Desert in Black Desert or the Wilderness in old-school RuneScape. In PvE, this wasn't a hindrance and encouraged me to stay on a beaten path to avoid being completely lost. I also noticed that even though your map is gone, you can still leave waypoints before becoming lost, and these can be still followed in a general direction, so you can cheese it if you want. As is tradition with V-Rising, difficult situations must be overcome before shortcuts can be made, and in this case we can eventually craft a cape using resources found inside the forest, which allow us to negate the mist debuff. Another great example of good game design making the player suffer through tough situations before eventually presenting a solution to lessen the burden. I just wish they'd implemented something to lessen the burden of the sun mechanics. It's time for us to take on a swath of new Act 3 bosses, and while exploring I encounter another boss similar to Beatrice from Act 2. Ben the Wanderer is another combat-style horde encounter where you'll have to chase him through the woods while he spouts nonsense, causing nearby enemies to aggro.
I'm a leaf on the wind.
Ben was a more difficult encounter for me than Beatrice because he'll fire wisps which root and slow you, and if you get too far away he'll reset. When I first fought this guy, I thought he might be a reference to Obi-Wan Kenobi or something, but when I googled it, it turns out Ben the Wanderer is an MMA fighter. I don't know. Let me know in the comments, am I being dumb again? I also conquer Angora the Spider Queen, who grants us the ability to turn into a spider, which is pretty cool. When you're in spider form, you can burrow underground to avoid sunlight and enemies, but you can't move. At least we can use this to go AFK in the daytime. Several endgame systems start to come into play here as well, with the Ancestral weapons system being the first. As you play, you'll encounter shattered weapons, upgradable versions of older items that aren't usable until repaired. Once you've defeated Octavian in Act 2, you'll unlock the Ancestral Forge, which allows you to repair these weapon shards, and this process requires more and more advanced resources, and the previous version of that weapon in order to bring it back to life. And I really like this system. It keeps older crafting materials and components relevant into the endgame, which is sometimes better than adding endless levels of equipment and resources just to keep the game feeling complex. It doesn't devalue your previous achievements, and still gives use to older equipment and buildings. Once restored, these weapons have a higher item level to increase your gear score, and they also come with an effect. For example, this whip adds life leech on hit, and there are a good amount of extra weapon effects which you can use to further augment your build. Eventually I found another whip, which causes skeletons to burst out of defeated enemies, which worked wonders for my necromancer build. The only problem with this system was that for me to use our new shiny ancestral weapon, we also need to find the recipe for the older weapon as well, and I found myself often relying on weapons that I'd already unlocked, rather than trying out new ones, which limited my build diversity to some extent. But if you're into it, grinding is always the solution. After a modest amount of farming resources, I set my sights on finishing up the Act 3 bosses, and there's a few which stood out to me, particularly Wilfred the Village Elder. Wilfred is the leader of one of the villages in the Cursed Forest, and if you were to visit this location by day, you'd find it to be completely normal. But during the night, he and the other villagers will transform into werewolves, making him another target on our hit list. Wilfred has some movement-based abilities, which require you to track him and move accordingly. And this is another great example of how good the combat system in V-Rising actually is, with its League of Legends style skill shots and timing-based dodges. Dodging, attacking, blocking, spellcasting, and weapon swapping all fluidly come together, and combining these with a boss that also has very fluid movement mechanics created a really memorable boss fight. In particular, I enjoyed the act of weapon swapping during combat, which is possible if you're able to manage multiple sets of cooldowns and abilities, which adds a nice layer of difficulty and complexity to those who want to get the most out of it. In another cool touch, if you don't kill Wilfred by the time the day arrives, you'll turn back into a human and your kill won't count. This is pretty annoying, but I'll let you have this one game because it's a good use of the day and night cycle. The final boss of Act 3, Sirel the Cursed Smith, is located nearby, inside the Cursed Village inside the Cursed Forest, and I would hazard a guess that this place might be cursed. Sirel wasn't as difficult as the other Act bosses, but was still a good fight overall. He has a number of cool voice lines and a few mechanics, including the ability to summon various spectral weapons, which use different attacks, requiring you to manage these by killing them to avoid being overwhelmed. This one only took me 2 tries to beat, surprisingly, and with Act 3 finished, we're free to move into Act 4 in the endgame. In Act 4, the difficulty ramps up again with the introduction of new areas like Silverlight Hills, Gloomrot North, and the ruins of Mortium, the home of Dracula himself. Enemies start to increase in level, and you'll frequently start to encounter packs of enemies at level 70 onwards. And this is where I started to experience some frustration when travelling around the map, because many of these enemy clusters have some ranged attackers mixed in. You'll need to very carefully time your dodges to avoid being knocked out of wolf form, which becomes really annoying when you're just trying to pass by for the 10th time. I mean, just look at this. I know using a horse would probably solve this issue, but if I can shapeshift into a wolf at will, I feel like it's more fun to do that. At around level 80, you do have the opportunity to fight Talzer the Winged Horror, who unlocks bat form and allows you to fly around the map as well, and this is well worth picking up if you're strong enough. Alongside this, the silver mechanic started to become problematic as well, and in Act 4 you'll be collecting gold sun coins, silver coins and silver ore, and when you have a lot of these items floating around in your inventory, you'll start to suffer pretty heavy damage. There were times when I wasn't even able to get back to my base before dying to silver sickness, which meant I had to respawn and die multiple times just trying to walk back to base. Combining these issues with the sun mechanics and the scarcity of resource points made Act 4 feel a little bit lackluster to me, mainly due to the travelling around. Of course, the answer here is just to get good, but I feel like the developers were intentionally trying to slow me down with claustrophobic mechanics, which was a bit of a shame. On the plus side, we're introduced to more area-specific mechanics to add more of that spark. No pun intended. Gloomrot North features huge electrical explosions which you'll have to avoid when travelling around the map. And I know that I just ranted about annoying travel literally in the last sentence, but I really like the inclusion of unique region-specific mechanics, especially when they utilise the environment and already existing mechanics like the area of effect damage. And speaking of unique mechanics, power cores are another recipe that we'll be using for endgame crafting, and these require charged batteries to craft. Simply take your uncharged cells to Thunderstrike Peak, and here you'll need to dodge thunderstorm explosions with enemies trying to kill you, and this adds a nice extra layer of immersion to the crafting system. The bosses of Act 4 and beyond are significantly more challenging than anything we've faced so far. Take Barrel de Bouchon for example. Sorry, Baron de Bouchon. This goofy barrel-throwing lunatic spouts nonsense while darting around the arena. Seriously, I feel like this guy is the secret antagonist of the Ratatouille movie or something. The main mechanic of this fight involves dodging barrels which form a line, rolling from one end of the arena to the other. And this is one of the more memorable boss fights, and while not as intense as say Mythic Raiding in WoW, it still offers a solid challenge, especially when you're a level or two lower. Throughout my time with V-Rising, and even after defeating probably around 40 bosses, I was still enjoying all of them, and every single one presents its own unique experience, which is really great. Defeating the Baron unlocked storage chest upgrades, allowing us to store more items inside, which was a really well-paced upgrade because my chests were starting to become full. Upgrading buildings can become a little frustrating because the upgrades are usually slightly larger than their predecessors, and this often meant redesigning the whole room to accommodate them. This is a good spot for our new research desk, right? As I progressed through Act 4, I started to engage with some of the endgame systems, and these systems often tie into one another, allowing you to increase the power levels of your characters in new ways. The Rift Incursion system is the first of these endgame systems, and this allows us to track down and hunt portals across the map which open up at random times, and building the Eye of Mortium will allow us to track where and when these bad boys open. Rifts come in two flavours: Tier 1, which you'll need to be around level 55 to 60 to use, and Tier 2, which are recommended to be tackled at the endgame, around level 80. Both rifts spawn various types of enemies and eventually culminate in a boss fight which reuses bosses from the various acts. Completing these yields tier-specific rewards, including research recipes, ancestral weapon shards, and Stygian shards, which are used within endgame crafting recipes, and within the next endgame system, the Altar of Stygian Awakening. The altar is another structure to plop down in your base, allowing you to utilize the rewards of completing rifts and killing higher level enemies to unlock passive abilities. Passive abilities come in tiers 1 to 3, requiring more and more resources the higher you go. These endgame mechanics complement each other really well, and provide more things to do when you're looking for a break from climbing the vampiric ladder. I can imagine brutal mode would require you to fully utilize these systems to progress, which is really good to see. To finish the game, we're going to need to put Dracula back inside his coffin. But before we do that, we'll need to take on several challenging bosses. And by challenging, I do actually mean they were quite hard. These bosses are designed as endgame encounters, and they'll unlock various things to allow you to increase your character's power, such as the ability to craft Dracula's armor, flying around as a bat, increase tier levels of jewels to augment your skills, and so on. And you're going to need to use all of this if you want to succeed. Solaris the Immaculate is a great example of this. An endgame boss with a clear difficulty curve compared to, say, the Alpha Wolf from Act 1. Bosses of the higher levels start to take on raid encounter style feelings, and I'm pretty sure that this guy's been ripped straight out of Path of Exile. Does this remind anyone else of the boss from Act 5? Solaris has a number of interesting mechanics, and given that this fight takes place inside a church, you'll need to bring a holy resistance potion to even stand a chance. Our penultimate encounter is with Adam the Firstborn, found inside a castle inside Gloomrot North, and to get inside you'll need to blow up the gates with crafted EMP grenades. I'm assuming that this roadblock has been put in place to ensure that players are gated from coming here until they unlock power cores. But whatever. You also need to pull this lever before fighting him, and this is the only boss where something like this is used. Adam is tough. Like, really tough, and he'll use fast melee attacks and a combination of mechanics involving electricity that you'll need to avoid. Once he reaches 0 HP, he'll get back up for round 2 and you'll need to kill him again. This boss does a grab and throw attack as well, and if you're unlucky, he'll launch you right into a lightning beam which stuns you for a short amount of time. If you're really unlucky, you'll be stun locked and barbecued to oblivion. With Adam out of the way, our final challenge awaits, and you can find Dracula on the eastern section of the map. Dracula's castle is very obviously marked on the map, and I was excited to get inside to see what all the fuss was about. I also appreciate Dracula's character design. He just looks so classic vampire. The battle with the Vampire Overlord is challenging to say the least, and it'll probably take you more than a few tries to beat, especially if you're not equipped with top tier endgame gear. This fight has multiple phases, intermissions, quick attacks that need to be dodged, and adds that need to be killed. One of the most difficult aspects of these endgame bosses for me was the fact that sometimes patience is required, and many of these fights are lengthy, lasting several minutes, and a single mistake often ended up leaving me dead or close to death. Mistiming a dodge or taking unnecessary damage often ended up biting me in the arse, and often required restarting the whole fight. I was impressed with the boss battles overall. They're challenging, engaging, and fun to experience. Sort of like Cuphead. If you liked Cuphead, I reckon you'll like V-Rising. Once Dracula has been put to rest, you'll be rewarded with the final piece of Dracula's armor and the Throne of Darkness, a trophy for proving your vampire prowess to all of your friends. Overall, V Rising is one of those games that I'm glad to have finished, but I'm 100% sure that I'll be back for another playthrough, because it's jam-packed with content, endgame systems, difficult bosses, crafting, base building, and the fact that I can have an entirely new experience on Brutal Mode as well. I can see myself coming back and trying that one day. I hope you enjoyed playing through V Rising with me. In my opinion, this game is one to consider if you're on the fence, and if you've already played it in early access, it has a number of new additions that might influence you to give it another go with its full release. Over its early access period, the developers have added a lot of love and care, and it's probably gone on to become one of the best releases of 2024, or at least so far. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and leave a comment to let me know what you thought of V Rising, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this in the future. As I mentioned at the beginning, check the link to my Patreon page in the description of this video if you want to support the channel. And until next time, happy gaming.